The first war we can name did not begin with a world empire. It began with two Sumerian cities, a strip of fertile land, and the water that made that land valuable enough to kill for. Before the great empires, before Assyria, before Babylon became a name everyone knew, southern Mesopotamia was a landscape of cities trying to survive in the same flat world. Lagash and Umma were not separated by mountains or oceans. They were close enough for fields, canals, temples, and pride to press against each other year after year. The story matters because this is not just a vague memory of violence. It has names, it has rulers, it has a disputed place called the Gu'edena. It has a boundary said to have been drawn by Mesilim, king of Kish. It has an army of Lagash under Eannatum. It has later rulers who kept arguing over what had happened. And it has a broken monument famous enough to carry a brutal name, the Stele of the Vultures. That does not mean it was the first war human beings ever fought. People were violent long before writing. Villages raided other villages. Hunters fought. Fortified places existed before Sumer's cities left us inscriptions. But this conflict is different. Here the fog starts to clear. The ground has a name. The victors speak. The defeated city is named. The reason is not just glory, it is land and water. The evidence for this war did not survive like a modern archive. There is no battlefield report written by a neutral observer. There is no map with neat arrows, no treaty folder, no list of casualties checked by both sides. What survives is more ancient and more difficult. Royal inscriptions, broken stone, clay cones, and the official memory of kings who wanted their gods and their descendants to know who was right. The most famous object is the Stele of the Vultures, usually linked with Eannatum of Lagash. It was a victory monument, carved in stone, showing war as both human action and divine order. On one side, soldiers march and enemies fall. On another, the god Ningirsu dominates the defeated. The message is not subtle. Lagash did not merely win. Lagash claimed that the cosmic order itself had judged the dispute. Then there are inscriptions associated with later rulers such as Enmetena. These texts look backward, repeating old claims about boundaries, broken agreements, and the behavior of Umma. They are partisan, they defend Lagash. But they are also priceless, because they preserve a chain of names and actions. The historian's task is to read them carefully, not as pure truth, not as pure fiction, but as political memory made durable in clay and stone. The later Lagash tradition says that before the famous war, there had already been an attempt to settle the boundary. Mesilim, king of Kish, is remembered as the ruler who measured or marked the line between Lagash and Umma. That detail is important. It means the conflict was not presented as sudden chaos. It was presented as a dispute over a known border, a boundary that one side believed had already been settled. In modern language, it sounds simple. Draw a line, put up a marker, tell each city what belongs to it. But in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, a boundary was never just a line on dry paper. Fields shifted in value depending on water. Canals had to be maintained, silt built up. Labor mattered. Temples claimed land. Rulers claimed the favor of gods. A field could be an economic asset, a sacred possession, and a political insult at the same time. The disputed zone was called the Gu'edena. It was fertile enough to remember and valuable enough to fight over. Lagash's inscriptions frame Umma as the city that violated what had been established. Umma's own version is mostly lost to us, which already shapes the story. We hear the border through the voice of Lagash, and that voice insists that the line was old, legitimate, and broken by the other side. To understand why this became war, we have to stop imagining land as simply a patch of earth. In southern Mesopotamia, land needed water at the right time, in the right amount carried by canals that had to be dug, cleared, guarded, and managed. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water could ruin fields. Bad canal management could make neighbors suffer. A dispute over fields was also a dispute over labor, timing, access, and control. This was the world that made Sumerian cities powerful. The great rivers did not automatically create civilization. People did the work. They cut channels through mud. They organized teams. They stored grain. They counted rations. They paid workers. They gave temples and palaces the tools to command large landscapes. Water turned flat land into food, and food turned city leaders into people worth obeying. So when Lagash and Umma argued over the Gu'edena, they were not only arguing about pride, they were arguing about the productive machine beneath city life. A canal could feed households, supply temples, and support soldiers. A disputed field could become a tax base. A border could decide which god received offerings from the harvest. That is why the first war we can name feels strangely familiar. The weapon is ancient, but the pressure is not. The inscriptions from Lagash accuse Umma of crossing the boundary, taking land and refusing the arrangement that earlier authority had established. We should hear the accusation for what it is, a legal and religious argument as much as a military one. Lagash is not simply saying they attacked us. Lagash is saying they violated the rightful order. That distinction matters because early states needed stories that made violence acceptable. A ruler could not only gather men and say, "I want more land." He needed a claim. He needed a god behind him. He needed the enemy to be described as a trespasser, an oath breaker, or a rebel against a boundary older than the present crisis. In the Lagash version, Umma becomes that enemy. We do not have an equal counter-archive from Umma explaining how they understood the dispute. Maybe they believed the boundary was unfair. Maybe the water system had changed. Maybe the old decision had been imposed by a stronger outside power. Maybe Lagash exaggerated. Those possibilities are exactly why the story has to be told carefully. But careful does not mean empty. The surviving texts still show us a world where a border dispute could harden into organized war, and where memory itself became a weapon. Eannatum of Lagash enters the story as the ruler whose victory made the conflict famous. In the inscriptions and monument, he is not just a military leader. He is the chosen servant of Ningirsu, the city god whose land, honor, and cosmic authority stand behind Lagash. The war is therefore framed as a human campaign with divine permission. Picture the mobilization not as a Hollywood empire, but as an early city-state turning its own institutions toward violence. Men who worked fields and canals could be drawn into military service. Administrators could track supplies. Rulers could invoke temple authority. Weapons, shields, standards, and marching formations turned a local quarrel into a public act of power. The Stele of the Vultures gives one of the most striking visual memories of that power. Lagash soldiers appear as an organized body, shields and spears packed together, the individual man almost swallowed by the formation. It is not a scene of loose raiders. It is the image of a city that can make men move as one. That may be the deeper historical shock. By the time we can name this war, warfare is already bureaucratic, ritualized, and political. The city has learned how to fight with a collective body. We cannot reconstruct every movement of the battle. We do not know exactly where each unit stood, how long the fighting lasted, or how many people died. The surviving evidence is not a battlefield drone view. It is a victory memory. But even a victory memory tells us what the winners wanted, remembered. Lagash wanted people to remember order. Soldiers advance in formation. Enemies are trampled. Bodies lie beneath the victors. Vultures carry away severed heads or fragments of the defeated. The image is brutal, but it is not random brutality. It is a statement about what happens when a city and its god punish a violator. That is why the vultures matter. They make the battlefield impossible to clean up in the imagination. The dead are not only defeated, they are exposed. They become part of the public warning. In a world where monuments spoke across generations, the image says, "This is what Umma's challenge produced. This is what the boundary cost. This is what Lagash can do. The reality was probably messier than the monument. Fear, noise, dust, confusion, and pain do not fit neatly into royal art, but the monument preserves the political meaning of the battle. Lagash turned a violent event into a carved lesson. The Stele of the Vultures is one of those objects where the closer you look, the harder it becomes to separate art, evidence, and propaganda. It is historical evidence because it preserves names, imagery, and claims connected to the Lagash and Umma conflict. It is propaganda because it speaks from the victor's side. It is art because the scenes are composed to make power visible. On the human side, Eannatum and his army dominate the defeated. On the divine side, Ningersu appears as the larger force behind the victory. The god captures enemies in a net, making the enemy army look trapped, not just by soldiers but by supernatural judgment. This is not only a picture of what happened, it is an argument about why it happened. The broken state of the Stele also matters. We are not looking at an untouched ancient newsreel. We are looking at fragments, found and studied long after the society that made them disappeared. Modern museums, archaeologists, philologists, and historians have had to assemble meaning from pieces. That makes the object more powerful, not less. Even broken, it carries the central message clearly. The war over the boundary was important enough to carve in stone, and the victors wanted their version to outlive them. After victory, the story does not simply stop. In the Lagash tradition, the defeated side is forced into oaths, obligations, and recognition of the boundary. This is where the conflict becomes more than a battle story. It becomes a legal and ritual drama. Ancient treaties and oaths were not casual promises. They called gods as witnesses. They imagined curses. They turned political agreements into sacred danger. If Umma accepted terms and later broke them, the violation was not merely diplomatic. It was an offense against divine witnesses. That made the boundary harder to deny and the next conflict easier to frame as punishment. This is also why royal inscriptions can feel repetitive. They keep returning to who established the boundary, who violated it, who restored it, and who swore what repetition is not a flaw in the ancient record. It is the point. The text is trying to make the claim durable. It wants later rulers, temple officials, and gods to hear the same chain of legitimacy again and again. The result is an early example of a pattern that never really disappears. War ends on the battlefield, but the argument continues in documents, ceremonies, monuments, and memory. One reason we can follow the Lagash and Umma conflict at all is that later rulers kept reopening the file. Enmetena of Lagash, sometimes rendered Enmetena, left inscriptions that look back on the boundary dispute and describe earlier stages of the conflict. These texts are not detached history writing in the modern sense. They are political arguments made by a ruler with a stake in the story. But that is exactly why they are useful. They show that the war did not fade as a single episode. It became precedent. It became a memory later rulers could use. If Enmetena wanted to defend Lagash's rights, he could point backward. He could say the boundary had history. He could say earlier kings and gods had already decided the matter. He could claim that present policy was not aggression but restoration. The clay cone is a perfect symbol for this kind of memory. It is small compared with a monument, but it is stubborn. It can be buried in a foundation, placed in a sacred or official context, and survive when palaces collapse. A cone is not dramatic like a battlefield, but it may be more durable. The war lived not only in stone vultures, but in written claims embedded in the architecture of power. If the story ended with one clean victory, it would be simpler and less human. But the conflict between Lagash and Umma belongs to a longer world of rivalry. The boundary dispute flared across generations. Rulers changed. Political fortunes shifted. The same land could become a symbol again and again because the underlying pressures did not disappear. Later, Umma would rise under Lugalza Jezi.
a ruler who became powerful enough to dominate much of Sumer before Sargon of Akkad changed the scale of Mesopotamian politics.
That later history should not be collapsed into Eannatum's battle, but it reminds us that city-state rivalry was not a small footnote. It was the engine of a whole political world. Lagash itself would experience defeat, recovery, reform, and new rulers. Umma was not permanently erased. No ancient victory monument could freeze the future. The Stele of the Vultures shows what Lagash wanted remembered at one moment, but history kept moving around it. That is another reason this topic is powerful. The first war we can name already contains the problem of every later war story. The winner carves the monument, but the loser does not vanish from history. The conflict keeps generating new claims. The temptation is to make the Lagash Umma war feel exotic. The names are old, the gods are unfamiliar, the art is strange to modern eyes, but the deeper logic is not exotic at all. Communities fight when survival, wealth, identity, and legitimacy converge in one place. In Sumer, water made that convergence visible. Water was not simply a natural resource sitting outside politics. It had to be moved. It had to be scheduled. It had to be defended. If one city changed a canal, neglected a channel, took a field, or claimed a border zone, another city could feel the consequences in grain, labor, offerings, and prestige. The material and the sacred were tied together. That is why this conflict can feel modern without forcing a cheap comparison. We still live in a world where rivers, borders, irrigation, and scarcity shape politics. We still argue over who controls infrastructure. We still turn resource disputes into moral stories about who is rightful and who is trespassing. The ancient Sumerians did not think like us in every way. Their gods, institutions, and categories were their own. But the pressure of water on power is a language we can still understand. The honest version of this story has to keep two ideas in tension. First, the Lagash Umma conflict is extraordinarily valuable because it gives us one of the earliest named wars in the historical record. Second, the sources are biased, fragmentary, and shaped by royal self-defense. We can know that Lagash and Umma were remembered as rivals over a boundary. We can know that the Gu'edena mattered. We can know that Mesilim's earlier boundary was invoked. We can know that Eannatum's victory was monumentalized. We can know that later rulers such as Enmetena used the old dispute to make claims about legitimacy. We can see how gods, fields, canals, oaths, and armies were woven together. What we cannot do is pretend we have a neutral transcript. We cannot casually count the dead. We cannot recover Umma's full argument. We cannot treat every royal claim as if it were a modern court record. The right approach is not cynicism. It is disciplined reading. Partisan sources can still preserve real events. Propaganda can still reveal political structure. A broken monument can still show us what an early state wanted the future to remember. That is why the phrase matters. The first war we can name, not the first war ever. There is a reason this episode does not simply say the first war in history. That would be cleaner. But it would also be wrong. Human beings fought long before the Lagash Umma dispute. Archaeologists have evidence of organized violence, trauma, fortifications, and raiding in worlds much older than Sumerian royal inscriptions. Writing did not invent war. What writing did was change what later people can know. Once rulers began leaving names, claims, places, and monuments, violence entered a different kind of memory. It could be quoted, it could be disputed. It could be tied to a field, a god, a boundary, and a ruler. That is why the Lagash Umma conflict sits at such an important threshold. The danger is that the surviving record makes the literate world look like the beginning of everything. It was not. It was the beginning of a new visibility. Many earlier conflicts were real, but they remain unnamed to us. Lagash and Umma are different because the ancient state turned conflict into documentation. That makes the story more interesting, not less. The question is not when humans first became violent, The question is when war became something a city could narrate, justify, archive, and carve into public memory. In that sense, the water dispute between Lagash and Umma is one of the first wars history lets us follow by name. In the end, the Lagash-Umma conflict is not famous because it was the largest ancient war. It was not. It is not famous because it settled the politics of Mesopotamia forever. It did not. It matters because it stands near the beginning of named historical violence, where war stops being only archaeology and starts becoming story. We can say Lagash, we can say Umma, we can say Eannatum, we can say Enmetena. We can point to the Gu'edena and to the canals and fields that made the boundary dangerous. We can stand in front of the broken Stele of the Vultures and see how a city wanted victory to look. We can read the later inscriptions and hear a ruler trying to make old claims useful again. That is the threshold this episode is really about, not the moment humans became violent. That was much earlier, not the moment states invented propaganda. That was already underway. The threshold is when violence becomes recoverable in names, places, images, and written arguments. The first war we can name was over water, because water made land valuable. Land made cities powerful. Cities made rulers ambitious. And rulers, once they won, made sure the story was carved, buried, repeated, and remembered.